Welcome to the lecture on Chapter 3, Themes in Art. Now with this lesson we're going to look at some of the themes in art, although this is really too vast a subject for us to cover in depth, but at least it will spark you all to begin to think about some of the different reasons that people do make art. Now in our textbook it says basically that art always has to be about something. I'm not sure that it does. Sometimes art is just created for the pure pleasure of working with color rather than having a definite theme. What we're looking at now is a pastel painting by the artist Edgar Degas. It's called The Entering of the Masked Dancers, and you can see them in the background. Now, Degas often depicted ballet dancers. In fact, these dancers were really a prominent theme in the art of Degas. However, he always shows his dancers in sort of the awkward poses. See, the one on the right is loosening the band from her neck. The one on the left looks sort of like she's saying, whew. He likes to capture his dancers in their off moments, in their awkward moments, and this really humanizes them. So humanizing dancers would be the prominent theme in much of the work of Edgar Degas, although he did other work as well. So for this lesson, we're just going to look at some of the themes, beginning with the sacred realm. Now, throughout history, humans have tried to touch something that is greater than themselves, or they have felt some kind of a sacred possibility and have worked in their lives to create a connection to that. Throughout the world, there's different traditions, but there are similarities within these traditions. And often the sacred is expressed in a sacred space. We can look all the way back to the ruins at Stonehenge, or even earlier into the cave paintings, to see what the early people created as their sacred spaces. So what we're looking at now is the cathedral in Barcelona, Spain. And this was built during the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, and you can see it's a site that must really inspire a feeling of the sacred. If you look closely, you can see the very small altar at the bottom of the picture, so that might give you a feeling of how huge this space is. So let's stay in Spain, but let's move religions, shall we, to the great mosque at Cordoba. Now this is one of the great buildings that has remained from the ancient world, and it was built in the 8th century, designed to house literally thousands of worshipers. So in this setting, the worshipers were to be really shoulder to shoulder as they knelt together in prayer, whereas in this other setting, people are more seated in the congregation. But what these two places share is a dedication to inspiring a feeling of reverence for the sacred. So let's move on and look at sacred objects. Again, this is such a big subject that we can really only touch upon it here. Now this is a Kuan Yin, or a female Buddha, really, and she is located at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. This is actually really one of the wonders. I mean, it's a great artistic wonder. It's a life-size sculpture that's in a room at the Nelson Atkins Museum that they've recreated to be like a Buddhist temple. And this is a very powerful image that I've sat with many times. And when you go into this room, all sorts of people are in there just sitting with this image and the other Buddhas that are in the room. Whatever one's religious persuasion, it doesn't really matter. Sitting with these figures, there's just an emanating feeling of peace. And you'll see that in a small child might be crying, come into the room and get quiet. It has that kind of a feeling. So let's hold on to that kind of idea of a religious object invoking a feeling of peace, and then let's move on to a figure of Mary and Jesus. Again, this is from the Middle Ages. And in some ways this is similar in that it's a seated female figure, and it also, in fact, if we look at it, the actually position is very similar, but it's from the Christian faith instead of from the Buddhist faith. Yet what is the purpose? Probably to invoke a feeling of peace and of reverence for the spiritual realm. Now let's look at politics and the social order. And this is basically art created in order to have a political impact. Actually, art has been created for that reason for really time immemorial. What we're looking at here is the temple to Ramses II in Egypt. And it was built, oh, I think about 3000 BC, 4000 BC, give or take 100 years or so. And it's part of a vast temple complex that was built to honor the king. What's so interesting about the Egyptian ruins is that they were almost all built to honor the pharaohs after they were dead, in the afterlife. So the Egyptians spent much of their living, breathing life making huge monuments to honor their rulers after they were dead, which is just sort of an interesting perspective. And yet it managed that religion, that belief, managed to keep Egyptian society stable for thousands of years. And the art really didn't change that much in that period of time. So now let's look at another way that art can be used, and that is as what we call propaganda. You know, to make people feel an emotional reaction to some kind of a power that be, a power at large. This is what's left of some big sculptures of Constantine, who was the last great ruler of the Roman Empire. Now, when this sculpture was fully put together, it was probably something like 50 feet high, because when we look at the head part, that's over 8 feet tall. Okay, and it was on a full life-sized figure. We can see the hand and the shoulder there also. Now here's how the Romans did it. This was very interesting. You know, they conquered much of Europe and up into Scotland and down into the Persian Empire. So they had a huge empire. And they couldn't really have the emperors there all the time. But what they could do is they would put up these statues throughout the empire to remind people that they were in fact ruled by Rome. And one of the funny things that happened, I'm not so sure it happened with this one of Constantine, but in the earlier sculptures, they'd be these big sculptures in the towns to, you know, remind people constantly of the role that Rome played as the ruler. But sometimes there would be a new pharaoh, a new leader in Rome, and so they would just lop the head off this existing sculpture and put a new head on it, so people could still be reminded of who was in charge. But that would just change, you know, with the fortunes of those leading in Rome. Now, I'd like to look at a little different kind of political and social art. This is a great artist named Daumier. It looks like Daumier if you see it written. And as I'm doing often in these lectures, I'm deviating a little bit from the images that are in your book, but basically we're making the same points. So I really enjoy this artist because what he did was he depicted the lower classes in Europe during a time when very few artists did that. Successful artists in Europe at this time, which would be the late 18th century, they would really depict only the nice scenes. They didn't depict the people that were suffering. This is called third-class carriage, and it's basically that part of the train where you just paid a little bit of money, and there's probably roosters in there, maybe somebody's bringing a pig along, and they're all just crammed in to travel at the most economic way possible. So, and Daumier, he was very good at this, at raising an awareness of the lower classes of people that were in fact suffering, while the upper classes were kind of living in excess during this time, right around the French Revolution and during the years that followed. Now let's look at a different kind of propaganda. This is a World War II recruitment poster. And basically, you know, there's tons of these from World War II, well, from really a lot of the wars in the 20th century. And it's basically trying to get people all gung-ho to go support the war effort. There's some of them that tell people to plant a garden in support of the war effort. There's a lot of these, and they're really interesting. And basically, propaganda is just art that makes you feel a certain way, and maybe it would inspire patriotism. And that's very interesting that here's one from the Nazis. Okay, here she's another cute little girl, and she's got flowers on her little money cup, and I don't speak German, maybe some of you do, but she's basically saying, come on, support our great cause in the exact same way that this woman is, except for these are the good guys in the way most people look at it. These not so good. See the little swastika on her little cup? Very interesting. They're both propaganda. So let's move on and talk about stories and histories in art. Now this has been a way that art's been used throughout, well, really since the Renaissance. Let's start there. Here's what's funny, is that during the Renaissance, if you depicted a nude figure that was like from the current time period, oh my gosh, I mean, you just couldn't do that. That was so scandalous. But if you depicted something that was from mythology or from history, then it was totally okay to put a nude in there. It was just one of the rules of art. In fact, it was even delineated in a book of rules about art. So most of the stories that they told in the art of that time period, many of them were about saints or about religious experiences. Maybe Christ and Mary and all those stories of the Bible. And that would be in Europe, is what we're talking about. So I find this one particularly interesting because it is Saint Francis. And he was pretty much one of the people that was responsible for moving the Catholic Church away from almost being royalty and helping it to be more of a church of the people. So in this story, St. Francis has been preaching a sermon and the birds will not stop squawking. So he turns to the birds and he says, will you just be quiet and let me finish my sermon, and then you get your own sermon. So this is St. Francis preaching to the birds, and he's giving them their own sermon because they were kind enough to quiet down so he could complete his. I just think that's a cool story. It's by the artist Giotto. It's very old. It's before the Renaissance. So I believe painted in the late 1200s, the 13th century. Let's look at just a bit more of propaganda real quick. Here we have Washington crossing the Delaware. There you have it. Classic political art. I'm sure it was nothing like this, but when people saw this art, they were inspired by their great leader. And here's another one. This is planting the flag at Iwo Jima. It's the World War II memorial, and many of us are familiar with this. This is the memorial that was created to honor all those who gave their lives in World War II. Now, it came from this original photograph. However, let's go back and look. Sculpture, photograph. Okay, so you can see the artist kind of leaned the figures over a little bit more. But here's what we know about this. They planted the flag once after this terrible battle with the Japanese. And then the photographer said, oh man, you got to do that again. So then all the guys got back out there and they did it again a second time. Let's look at one more political bit of art. And this is a very important piece in the history of Western art by Pablo Picasso again. It's called Guernica. And this Guernica is a town in Spain, a little town in the North Basque country. This is a country in Spain that's sort of, they have different beliefs than the mainstream Spanish people, and they're separatists. They do not want to be part of Spain, and so they're like a thorn in the side of Spain. This town in the Basque region, the town is Guernica. So before World War II, Adolf Hitler had a new kind of bombing called saturation bombing, and he wanted to practice and see what would happen. So Franco, the leader of Spain, gave him permission to bomb this town. And according to reports, over 5,000 people were killed. No, that's what Pablo Picasso said. It was a lot of people died unnecessarily so the Nazis could practice their new bombing technique. So Picasso was outraged, and he created this piece. Now it's 28 feet long, over 10 feet tall, and he could not display it. He was going to display it at the World's Fair, but it had to be rolled up and smuggled to New York until well after the war. Okay, we're going to move on with the next slideshow. Thanks for listening.